Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Systems Thinking, a crucial BA skill in an uncertain world. And on behalf of IIBA, thanks for joining us today. Today's webinar is an exclusive IIBA membership event. It is designed to deliver practical resources for you, the business analysis professional, as you continue to hone your skill set and deliver value within your organization. At IIBA, we are all about uniting a community of professionals to create better business outcomes and to provide the tools to help you climb the ladder of success. And we are all here today to do just that. Today, we are pleased to have back with us Adrian Reed, who will discuss the importance of systems thinking in business analysis, what it is, some practical techniques you can apply to the BA world, and how, when embraced, the practice can help an organization learn. Adrian is a true advocate of the business analysis profession. He is the principal consultant and director at Blackmetric Solutions, where he provides business analysis consultancy and training solutions to a range of clients in varying industries. Just some housekeeping tips. We will be having a question and answer period at the end of the session. So if you have any questions during the presentation, please enter them into the question box, and we will get to them at the end. And with that, please help me welcome Adrian Reed.
Well, thank you very much for the warm introduction, and welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. So the topic today is systems thinking, and it's probably fair to say that just about everyone dialed into this webinar would agree that we add a huge amount of value as BAs in helping our stakeholders to think holistically. And systems thinking is really very much about that holistic thinking. It's about looking beyond the immediate perceived problem, looking at some of the root causes, and really understanding how things interact to cause or exacerbate problem situations. But whilst we would probably all agree that, we've probably all experienced situations where our stakeholders just want to get going, where they've perhaps already chosen a solution. And we might also find that in our day-to-day sort of day job, that when we hear the word system, people are actually referring to just the IT. But as BAs, we know, of course, that you can deliver the best, most functional IT system in the world, but if that's not supported by processes, by skilled people, if it's not in a collaborative culture, then that solution could still fail. So we're going to talk about those sorts of holistic analysis techniques. Now, the other element to this title is an uncertain world. And whatever industry you're in, you're probably finding that things are moving faster than ever. It seems like every time we turn on the TV, certainly here in the UK, people are saying that the pace of change is getting faster. I certainly don't think I've ever turned on the news to hear someone say that the pace of change is getting slower and we can all relax a bit. So I think that we are ever skilled as BAs in helping our organisations adapt to that changing competitive environment, because it's really the organisations that can adapt and retain that organisational agility that are going to really survive and thrive. So my presentation is split into two main parts, built around three of the core BA questions. And I'll start in a second by talking a little bit about why systems thinking is useful, important, and I want to tell you a bit of a story about why I'm particularly interested in systems thinking. And I'll share with you a bit of a story and example. It's a bit of a curveball example, but stick with it. It does have a direct business parallel. Then I want to move on and talk about what and how. And in the second part of my presentation, we'll talk through some definitions, and I'll also talk through some techniques. some of which you may have seen before, but I want to talk through the multiple cause diagram and some causal loops and also some other concepts as well. So starting with why. Well, you can probably judge from my accent that I am from the UK, but what you may not be aware of is that I'm actually not from London. I'm actually from Portsmouth, which is a city on the south coast of the United Kingdom. And unless you live in the UK or you've been here, you probably wouldn't be aware that Portsmouth is actually an island. It's an island connected to the UK by 3 bridges, 3 road bridges and 1 rail bridge. Now, the reason I mention this is that this actually creates a really tricky, messy problem for Portsmouth City Council, the municipality, the city council that looks after Portsmouth. The actual city itself was built largely in Edwardian and Victorian times, so 1800, 1900s, and people weren't thinking about cars back then. And what this means is that the streets are very narrow, the houses are quite narrow. It's a real problem for congestion, it's a real problem for parking of cars. Parking in particular became a real problem about 15 years ago. Because unlike other cities, Portsmouth has very definitive boundaries. It's surrounded by water, you can't expand outwards. Depending on whose statistics you believe, it's either the most or the second most densely populated city in the UK, and some cities show it as being amongst the 5 or 10 most densely populated cities in Europe. And so with all of these cars, and with it becoming a more popular destination, parking became a real problem. Now that caused issues for residents, and Portsmouth City Council did what city councils do. It saw a parking problem and it decided to look for a parking solution. It applied logical, linear thinking to the situation. And Portsmouth City Council introduced a residents' parking zone towards the south of the island, where the problem was at its worst. Now this solved the problem. It meant that in order to park in certain streets to the south of the island, you had to be a resident and apply for a permit. Now it solved the problem very well if you happen to live in one of those streets. But what it rather predictably did was just displace the parking problem further north. And I bet you've seen situations like that in your own organisations, when a parking problem was perceived, a solution was, or not necessarily a parking, obviously a business problem was perceived, a solution was implemented, and it just moved the problem elsewhere. Now, because the problem was moved, residents towards the middle and further north of the island were not happy, and so they lobbied Portsmouth City Council, who then created a further set of residents' parking zones. And rather predictably, this displaced the problem further and further north in the island, until Portsmouth looked at actually removing some of those parking zones. So it created them, deleted them, created them again over a period of 10, 15 years, something like this. Now this picture here is, this was taken in Portsmouth Guildhall, where the City Council meetings are held. The gentleman standing there is Councillor Ken Elcombe, who at the time was the cabinet member, the elected cabinet member for traffic and transportation. That picture is taken from what's known as the Deputies Gallery. Now the Deputies Gallery, for those of you not familiar with sort of local politics, is where awkward residents sit when they're going to make a speech. And I am one of those awkward residents, because as a business analyst, this whole situation was driving me insane. It was like they were moving the problem around. No one was addressing the root cause. So there's public galleries to the left and right. You can't see those in the picture. I was seated in the Deputies Gallery. You're given 6 minutes to make a speech. I did what any good BA would do. I carried out research. I got data. I crafted a compelling, clear, a really concise 6-minute presentation. I could show that the decisions they were making about parking were not going to address the root cause, and that actually they needed to take, in my view, a more holistic approach, looking at the wider systemic factors. It's the one time in my life that I got a standing ovation. There were people in the public galleries sort of clapping and standing and stamping their feet, and I was like, yeah, this is democracy in action. It really felt like I'd made a difference. And other residents spoke, and then the politicians debated, and then there was the vote. And I waited with anticipation, only to find all the politicians voted on party lines, and us residents hadn't changed a single thing. Now, I was disappointed, but really in retrospect I shouldn't have been surprised, because that situation was inherently political. One of the significant influences on that problem situation was politics. And I'd gone in there with facts and figures, giving the politicians really the only option, if they agreed with me, would have been to perform a U-turn. And certainly in British politics, a U-turn is like career suicide in politics. So I hadn't necessarily clocked onto the political aspects of that situation. Now, what's really interesting is the problems that myself and other residents had predicted would happen if these decisions were made have happened. This next picture I'll show you is a picture of what some people now do to reserve their parking space. This is what I call a bin car parking moment. Someone has introduced a workaround to the official process to make sure they can actually get their car parked. And although this is a different example to the types of things we see in business analysis, I bet there are bin parking moments in your organisation, my organisation, every organisation. Workarounds which happen because somebody's displaced the problem from one part of the organisation to another. And if you think about what Portsmouth City Council did in this example, well, they perceived very logically a lack of available parking. They looked for a linear solution. They looked for a solution that was close to the problem. So they created a residence parking scheme. Trouble was that displaced the parking. So they then started removing residence parking schemes. And this could continue forever if we let it. And for those of you familiar with physics or maths, you might be sensing a certain amount of oscillation here, because there's a change in policy from residence parking to deleting back to residence parking. But at every turn of that oscillation, money is wasted, because there needs to be consultation, changes in signage, all of these sorts of things. And I bet you recognise that sort of frustrating recurrence of themes, like organisations struggling to learn. I bet you recognise that from some of the organisations or clients that you work with. Perhaps you have organisations that go from centralisation to decentralisation to centralisation, or from offshoring to onshoring to nearshoring to offshoring. And at every turn, at every oscillation, money is potentially burnt. And if you think about it, drawing on the parking example, it's because it wasn't a linear problem. It was a messy spaghetti nest of a problem. I think one thing we do really well as BAs, without even necessarily thinking about it, is we de-spaghettify problem situations. We help people understand the complexity. In this example, what other factors were driving the parking problem? Well, seemingly unrelated things like zoning and planning decisions. Where houses were built or renovated or turned into apartments drives demand. National taxation decisions, the amount of tax that you apply to gasoline, to petrol, affects the desirability of car ownership. Public transport policy. You know, at the same time that there was this parking problem, prices of public transport was increasing. And the thing which I initially forgot was the need for a political win. So it was anything but linear. It was a big, messy problem with so many intertwined, intertangled problem causes, and of course much, much more. Those are just 4 examples. And I don't know about you, but I find that in the types of organizations I work, the clients I work with, the stakeholders I meet, often there's an allure of linearity. Linearity has an allure. People almost want to deceive themselves that there's a nice linear solution out there for them. And it's human, it's understandable. We all want certainty. So here are just a few examples of linear cause-effect type situations which I've come across. You may well have seen these or similar, so feel free to have a wry smile along if you recognize these patterns. In a service center environment, we might have a situation where the call waiting time is too long. So what do people ask for? They ask for more phone lines, which you could certainly do, but you'd probably need more people, more desks, more computers, and actually a better course of action might be to work out why so many people are ringing in the first place. Maybe it's failure demand. Maybe we can get it right first time and not have so many calls through to the contact center. My favorite one is that, there's a data quality problem. And what do organizations tend to do when there's a data quality problem? Well, often what they do is go out and buy more IT. Because, of course, the best way to fix data quality is to migrate it from one system to another. I suspect we've all seen projects like that. In fact, I think it's about time as a discipline, as a community, that we reclaim the S word. So often when stakeholders say the S word, when they say system, they're talking about IT. But actually, businesses, organizations exist in a wider, broader system of people, processes, locations, data, and we need to encourage that kind of holistic thinking. Or we might have someone seeing dropping sales. So what do they say? They say we need an app, because everyone needs an app. But actually, maybe the app isn't solving the sales problem. Maybe there's a competitor out there that's doing things differently. There's a disruptor, and we need to understand that broader environmental factor. Because if we treat those tricky problems as if they were linear, we'll end up with oscillation, we'll probably waste money not solving the problem. But this is hard because we have to work with stakeholders. And stakeholders are great, they're like gold dust, they're wonderful to work with, but we've probably all worked with some stakeholders who look a bit like this. And they say things like, just do it. I don't want to hear about any of this strategic analysis, this enterprise analysis, this systems thinking stuff. I've already made my mind up. The JDI approach to project management. The danger is if we don't feel empowered, if we don't feel empowered enough to stand up and at least question that approach, then what we might inadvertently end up with are those bin parking moments in our own organizations. As BAs, we can help our stakeholders make really informed decisions by calling out those potential warning signs. And there's so much we can do to do that. So I'm going to move on now and talk about some definitions and also some techniques that we could use. And in this part of the presentation, I have 3 main parts. I'll talk through some formal definitions of what I mean by system, and I'll introduce a few concepts. I'll then run through some techniques and some wider considerations as well. But actually, before I get on to definitions, I wanted to start by saying that there really is no one systems thinking. Now this slide here, this just lists some of the systems thinking traditions that as it happens, that I've come across. That's not to say this is an exhaustive or extensive list by any means, but there's so much out there. If you want to know more about any of these, just connect with me afterwards. I can send you details of further reading. If you're interested, the specific traditions that we're going to touch upon in this webinar are systems dynamics. We'll also talk a little bit about soft systems, but we really will be scratching the surface. There is so much more out there. So a definition, what do we mean by system? Well, there are many definitions out there. One that I come back to time and time again is a definition from the Open University. And the OU defines a system in the concept of systems thinking as an integrated whole distinguished by its particular purpose for a particular observer. The whole's essential properties arise from the relationships between its parts. So the whole's essential properties arise from the relationships between its parts. And as BAs, I sense many of us now are having a sort of a really warm moment of recognition, because actually as BAs, so often what we do is we study, we examine the connections between things. It's not just about the individual tasks, it's about the end-to-end processes. It's not just about individual IT systems, it's about all the interfaces between them and the processes and the human beings that are operating them, and so on. So this is very aligned to what we do as BAs already. Now, a really core concept which sort of bounces off this definition is the idea of feedback. And I know in general business speak, feedback is used as quite a loose term. So we might think about the types of qualitative feedback we give each other at our end of year appraisal or whatever. But in systems thinking parlance, it's often useful to think about feedback as a type of signal. So I imagine it as like a current flowing through a circuit, and that circuit can read the current and respond to it, or choose not to. That might sound a bit abstract. So let me give you a concrete example. So I travel a lot with my work, and I suspect we have quite a few regular travelers on the line. One of the challenges if you travel regularly is every hotel shower seems to be different. This particular shower was from a very tall, it was from a London hotel, an old building that had been converted. The plumbing was really, really old. And I did what I suspect many of you and many travellers have done. I turn the shower on and it's really cold. So I turn it a bit more to the dial towards the hot, and nothing happens. So I turn it further to the hot, nothing happens. I turn it all the way to the hot, nothing happens, and then about 5 seconds later, scalding hot water is projected from the shower head. So what do? I have a bit of a knee-jerk reaction. I move it towards the cold, nothing happens, so I move it further, so I move it all the way to the cold, and then nothing happens, and 5 seconds later an icy blast of water comes out of the shower head. And so I nudge it gingerly towards the heat, and eventually I'm kind of moving it backwards and forwards until eventually I reach a comfortable temperature. Now, if you were to plot temperature over time of that shower, it would look something like this. Think back to that idea of oscillation. You've got an element of oscillation here, but it's dampened down at the end. It actually does reach the goal. It reaches the desired temperature. The reason we eventually reach the goal is there is feedback built in. So actually, if we as BAs can build feedback into the processes, into the projects, into everything we work on, we can help ensure that organizational goals are met. In fact, the reason there's so much oscillation in this example is because there is a delay between the intervention I made on the system and the feedback I got. That's a very convoluted way of saying there was a delay between me turning the dial and the temperature of the water changing. In organizational terms, if we can reduce that feedback delay, if we can ensure people that are making decisions get quality, appropriate, actionable information quicker, we can probably ensure that the organisation learns and that it doesn't repeat the same mistakes, it doesn't have that feedback delay built in. Now it's worth thinking, hold that thought about feedback, but when we're thinking about the types of projects and problems that we are working on or trying to solve, it's worth thinking about how complex they are. Now there are many ways of categorising problems, there are many systems thinking ways of categorising problems. I'm going to use a relatively straightforward one, but be aware there are others out there as well. And Russell Ackoff, who was a very famous systems thinker, differentiated between what he called difficulties. And difficulties are those problems that are fairly clearly defined. There's normally agreement that they are at least a problem. And normally there are solutions that you can pretty well see and prove. And actually linear thinking, if you're dealing with a difficulty, is probably fine. You know, if you just need to work out who the cheapest supplier of paper is in your city, well, systems thinking is probably not going to add a huge amount above more traditional linear thinking. Systems thinking might help you understand why you need so much paper, but that's a different question. On the other end of the spectrum, there's what Ackoff called a mess. And a mess is typified by conflict. There may even be no agreement over what the problem is. And in order to solve it, you need to use all sorts of hard and soft techniques. Now, Ackoff talked about these as being quite binary, but I think for BAs, it's often quite useful to think of a spectrum. And the particular types of techniques I'm going to be talking about today are particularly useful for problems that are at the messy end of the spectrum. So if you know, things that are really quite complex, spaghettified. What can happen though is if we are in a situation where we are perhaps inadvertently, or our stakeholders are inadvertently treating a mess as if it were a difficulty. So if we are treating a complex, knotty problem as if it were linear, then you end up with all sorts of problems, one of which being a pattern that's sometimes known as the false dichotomy. We're presented with what appear to be binary options, but when there are really other options open to us. So I'll give you a side example of that. So this picture was taken a depressingly long time ago. It is taken in the city of Rochester in the state of Minnesota, and the rather good-looking chap boarding the school bus is actually me. Because although I am British, I live in the UK, I actually spent some of my time, about a year and a half, growing up in Rochester, Minnesota. And I was there between grades, so I went up from one year group, one grade to the next. And just before the school holiday, the end of semester, my school friends were telling me, you know what, Adrian, next year you'll have to learn to play a musical instrument. And if you don't, you'll be forced to join the choir. Now, I've never been musical, but the thought of singing scares me. In fact, other than a few ill-advised karaoke moments in my adult life, I have never been one for singing. So throughout the school holidays, I thought about what musical instrument I wanted to play. I really wanted to play the violin, but I'd heard it was really difficult. So much to my parents' dismay, I chose the trumpet. And in my childhood naivety, my reason for choosing the trumpet was, how difficult can an instrument with only 3 buttons be to play? If you're wondering, the answer to that question is very difficult. In fact, if you don't know how to play a trumpet, it's very difficult just to make the thing make any sound at all. So after a few weeks, well, a few months actually, I was learning, but I slowed down. And I was having to do so much practice because I'm not naturally musical, I'd never studied music before, that other studies were suffering. Particularly my maths. And I remember, I think it was my teacher took me to one side and said, Adrian, why don't you give up the trumpet? You clearly don't enjoy it. You could spend an extra free period catching up on your math. And I said to my teacher, well, won't that mean I have to join the choir? And he said, no. Whatever gave you that idea? And I learned that actually it was largely extracurricular. There were some people that didn't learn an instrument at all. There were some people that did multiple instruments or had the instrument and joined the choir. I was presented with an either-or option. There were multiple other options. There was the option of doing nothing, which in business terms is an option our stakeholders sometimes don't think about, but it's one that should be examined. There was also the option of doing both. So I was presented with this false dichotomy and I didn't challenge it. But as BAs, we really, really must challenge those false dichotomies. Otherwise, we'll end up, metaphorically speaking, joining the choir to, or playing the trumpet to avoid joining the choir. I was trying to find a picture that would sort of summarize that whole idea of playing the trumpet to avoid joining the choir. I couldn't find one, but I was staying at a hotel, and genuinely this was the piece of art above the hotel bed. I have no idea what that hotel was thinking. I just hope that the art didn't come alive at night, because it was the sort of thing that nightmares are made of. Okay, so we've talked through some definitions. I'm keen now to move on to talk through some techniques. Don't forget, if questions do arise throughout the session, feel free to type them into the chat box or the question box. We'll take as many questions as we can at the end. So firstly, I'm sure many people on the call are familiar with the fishbone diagram, sometimes known as an Ishikawa diagram. It's a great technique. If you're not familiar with it, go Google it or look in BABOK version 3. If you've ever used it though, for a tricky, messy problem, you often find that you end up wanting to put causes or sub-causes under more than one branch, more than one fishbone. And that can be a sign that perhaps we're dealing with a mess rather than a difficulty. And there are other techniques we might want to use as well as or instead of a fishbone diagram. One technique that's extremely effective and often gets stakeholders really excited in my experience is the multiple cause diagram. Now with a multiple cause diagram, we take a state or an effect. Be aware I'm using those terms in quite loose terminology. There is a specific BA meaning of state and event, and I'm using it in a more loose term than that. But an example of a state might be revenue is dropping, or we're losing customers, something is changing. An event might be a disaster or a major event that's occurred. So a big customer's left us, or we've suffered a data loss, or whatever. Now actually conceptually, multiple cause diagrams are really, really simple. And I think this is why stakeholders love them. They require very little explanation. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to show you an abstract example, then I'm going to show you a real example. So this is an abstract example of a multiple cause diagram. You can see we've got the event or the state at the right-hand side, and then we have immediate proximate causes. So A and B in this example cause or exacerbate, they make worse the event or the state. However, A and B are also caused by D, E and G. G causes C, F causes D, and so on and so forth. So often what happens on projects, if we're stuck in a loop of linear thinking, is we might end up addressing just one cause, which won't necessarily solve our problem or create a better outcome, because there are so many other causes, secondary causes, tertiary causes, sub-causes, and unless we understand the bigger picture with our stakeholders, helping them, working collaboratively to co-create a holistic view, then we risk those bin parking moments. So that probably looks a bit abstract, so I'll show you a real example. The next slide, when I click over to it, it's quite busy. The slides will be available after, so if you want to take a good look at it, You can download them or you can watch the recording. And this is actually a worked example of the parking situation. This is initially just from my perspective. It's only a partial view, but you can see it works back from the event, the change in state, through various causes. So you can see over the right-hand side here, we have the cause, we have the state or event, and then we have lots of sort of hubs, causal hubs in the middle. And what's really interesting is actually this shows that parking itself isn't the problem. It's really a reliance on cars. You know, a lack of parking is arguably caused by a reliance on cars. If you can address the reliance on cars, your parking problem goes away, as do many other congestion problems too. There are also causal chains here. So, I mean, there are a number I could pick up on, but just one to mention is one of the many reasons I love Portsmouth is a very vibrant university city. The university is always growing, but what that means is you have a very high student population. That means that students tend to house share, which means you have more cars on the road for each house than if it were perhaps a family living there. And you could start to imagine, if you're trying to improve this situation, picking off a causal chain. Maybe we say, well, you know what, we're going to try and do something with students. We're going to offer free bus travel to all students and see if that convinces them not to take their car. Or we're going to encourage them to park at the university and not on the road, or whatever. And that won't alleviate all the problems on here, but it's a hypothesis of value. We can try it, we can test it. Now, in my experience, multiple cause diagrams, stakeholders love them. If you get around like a round table, get a flip chart in the middle, everyone's contributing. And they're really easy to read, really easy to understand. They're probably never going to be complete, but it creates a shared mental model of the problem situation and shows those bigger systemic factors at play. Now, what a multiple cause diagram doesn't show, however, is how these variables relate to each other. For that, a causal loop diagram can be very useful. These are a little bit more complicated, so I'll talk you through an example. Now, when I'm not on client site, I work from home. And in fact, I'm working from home today, and beneath my desk, there is a mini fridge. And you're probably now imagining what might be inside of that fridge. And it isn't beer, if you're wondering. If you were to open the mini fridge beneath my desk, you would find that there's a lot of water and also an awful lot of Pepsi Max. I'm a big fan of caffeinated soda, particularly Pepsi, and the reason I drink so much caffeine is I have a rather interesting relationship with sleep, in that I can't seem to get sleep when most the rest of the population is sleeping, so I sort of regulate my sleep patterns through caffeine. Now, for those of you that are similarly you have similar sleep challenges and use caffeine in a similar way, will probably know there's a bit of a feedback loop that happens here. So I'm going to show you an example of a reinforcing causal loop. I'll put the picture up, just get the shape of it, and then I'll explain it. So the first thing you can see is in the middle there's an R. And that reinforces the fact, or that denotes the fact that it's a reinforcing feedback loop. You also have variables around the causal loop. You have arrows and you have these pluses and minuses. The most important thing to take away from this slide is that the pluses and minuses aren't absolute. They're what's known as relationship polarity. What that means is, if there's a plus, the two variables move in the same direction. If there's a negative, a minus sign, they move in the opposite direction. So when you see a plus, think same. When you see a negative, think opposite. So here you can see that as my level of fatigue increases, I tend to consume more caffeine. because there's a positive relationship, they move in the same direction. But as the amount of caffeine I consume increases, the number of hours sleep I get decreases. But as the number of hours sleep I get decreases, the level of fatigue increases because it moves in the opposite direction. So that goes up, meaning this goes down. Now this is a reinforcing feedback loop, because as I feel more fatigued, well, what happens? I tend to drink more caffeine, so I actually get less sleep, so I'm more fatigued, so I drink more caffeine, so and so on and so forth. These are sometimes called vicious cycles, doom loops. They can also be virtuous cycles. If this was driving sales in an organization, it would be a good thing. But for caffeine consumption, it's probably a really, really bad thing. Now, of course, this isn't the only causal loop in operation, because if it were, I would be 100% caffeine and 0% sleep, and even I haven't managed to get it that far yet. So there's a balancing feedback loop at play, and I would represent that balancing feedback loop like this. So first of all, you notice there's a B in the middle, which denotes it's a balancing feedback loop, and again it tells a story. So as the amount of caffeine I consume increases, the level of physiological changes increases. And for any caffeine aficionados in the audience, you'll know that if you drink too much, your heartbeat gets very fast, it's quite unpleasant. What that means is my level of discomfort increases, and as that happens, it regulates the amount of caffeine I consume. So if we've got that balancing feedback loop happening, balancing, keeping a sensible equilibrium with the reinforcing loop. You could take it further and draw them together. This is just a sketch of those two feedback loops drawn together. Incidentally, the dynamics, this type of dynamic would create a bit of oscillation. So we're back to that theme of oscillation again. You see this dynamic happen in all sorts of systems. You see it in nature, like predators and prey have a dynamic relationship between each other. If there are too many predators, they eat all the prey, and then the predators can't survive, so there's fewer of those, so there are more prey, and so on. Homeostasis, the thing which keeps our temperature at 37 degrees centigrade, is or could be conceptualized as a series of feedback loops. I wanted to give you a very quick business example. This is a pattern I've seen in a number of organizations, although this is simplified. This particularly is relevant for organizations that receive post or email or service requests in. And what tends to happen is, for some reason, the number of inquiries increases. There's a peak. And what does that mean? Well, it means the time you take to respond increases. As that happens, the gap between the performance that your customers are expecting and your actual performance increases. So people expect you to respond in a day, but you're taking a week. So what happens? People chase. And that's a reinforcing loop, because as people chase, you've now got even more inquiries, which means you take even longer to respond, which means your gap gets even wider, which means you get more chases. And that would carry on forever, except there is a slightly sinister balancing loop, because eventually the level of customer satisfaction drops to such an extent that customers start leaving. There's then a delay before your number of inquiries start reducing, because as they leave, they tend to create inquiries, but then it balances down again. It's really important that we spot these feedback loops, because we can start to ask, why are there so many inquiries coming in? Why is it taking us so long to respond? And how can we stop that positive reinforcing feedback loop? What interventions can we make to stop that? And how can we stop that balancing feedback loop from occurring? Now, it's really curious. In systems thinking parlance, although as BAs we often use the word solution, in systems thinking the word intervention is often used. Now, that won't necessarily work in all situations, but the idea is, think back to that multiple cause diagram. You're never really going to know whether a solution is actually going to solve the problem, deliver the amount of value that's in the business case. But what we do is we have a hypothesis. And I think a lot of the time as BAs, we're really talking about a hypothesis of value. And if we can test and learn, we can probably hone those things even better. And that moves towards the whole thinking about organizational agility, which is a different but compatible thing with agile, but a broader thought. So, just to sort of close some of these ideas down before we open for a few questions. So some wider considerations. Well, I'm actually going to ask for some sort of like virtual rhetorical audience interaction in this next slide. I'm going to put a picture up, and what I want you to do is just think, or write down if you prefer, what it is a picture of. And this is just for your own benefit, and don't self-censor or shout at the screen, what is this a picture of? I'll give you 5 seconds to look at the picture and decide what it's a picture of. So, here's the picture. Okay, so hopefully you've written down what this is a picture of. Now, if we were all in the same room, I suspect some people would have said penguins. Some people would probably have said seaweed, or rocks, or the ocean. If you're from the UK, you might say seaside. If you happen to be familiar with or live in Cape Town, you might recognise this as Boulders Beach in Cape Town. Fantastic, beautiful place. But which one of us was right? Well, actually, we all are. It is a picture of penguins, it is a picture of rocks, but to some extent the boundaries are in the eye of the beholder. And we sort of see, to an extent, what we are looking for. To me, as a British person, I will see penguins, because penguins are really unusual to me. If you're used to them, they might blend into the background. Same's true of us and our stakeholders. We might find that people are looking at different boundaries of systems. You know, an underwriter might be looking at the system for creating profitable underwriting. But we need to remember that that fits within the insurance operation, which fits within the financial services, which fits within the, the economy, and there are factors pressing in at all of those levels. Appreciating that we all see different things when we look at the same problem is a really crucial consideration for BAs. Unpacking and understanding different stakeholders' perspectives so that we can move towards consensus, or at least an accommodation where people agree to move in a similar direction, or the same direction. It's also true that different people's perspectives play a part in how people see problems. And in fact, we all bring baggage to the table, including us as BAs. I know we like to try and be objective, but it's actually really hard. So let me give you an example. I've shown you one picture of me as a kid already. Well, here's another one. Again, depressingly long period of time ago. This is me on a vacation, a holiday in Italy. My parents had taken me and my brothers on a holiday. We rented a caravan on a caravan park. And there was a play park just around the corner from the caravan. One morning, my brother and my dad were out doing something. My mum was cooking breakfast, and I said to my mum, "Can I go and play in the play park?" And my mum said, "No." But I did what many kids would do. I went anyway. My mum was only probably 2 minutes behind me, but I ran to the play park, and you can't see it in this picture, but there was some swings just around the corner. And I thought I'd invented a new way of using the swing. I got on the swing, I turned the ropes of the swing around and let them sort of go back against each other. So it sort of spins you round in a circle. And I'm so excited. I'm like, this is awesome. I've invented a new way of using the swing. I want to go and tell my mum. So I ran back to the caravan. I ran, except I was dizzy. And after a few minutes of running, I realized I was lost. I was lost. I was like 4 years old, and I'm in Italy, and I don't speak Italian. My heart sunk. I can still vividly remember that feeling. That's how traumatic it was. Really fortunately, about 30 seconds later, a French family appear. I'm in tears by this point. The French father, came over to me, was very concerned. took me by the hand. He didn't speak English either, but he spoke a few words. And I was explaining the colour. He knew the colours. I was explaining that the caravan was white with green stripes. He took me by the hand and helped me to find my family. My family, who by now were absolutely terrified that they'd lost me. Probably only 5 minutes later, I was reunited with my family. And I still have really warm memories of this French guy who looked after me when when I was in a real time of need. Now, imagine that scene from my mum's perspective. Your child's gone missing, and the next time you see him, he's holding hands with a Frenchman. She probably jumped to a whole set of other conclusions, which in this case, fortunately, were not correct. But she brought to that situation a perspective and baggage about something that was not happening. And we all do this. Our stakeholders do it, we do it. I know, for example, I've done some work in a call centre, and it was a particularly toxic call centre. So I carry baggage about how call centres are managed. And I have to remember now that not all call centres are like that. But being aware of that baggage that we all bring, and knowing that our stakeholders probably have some of their own baggage, and that we can all be looking at the same situation but perceiving it very differently, is really, really crucial, particularly when we want to elevate thinking up to that broader, holistic, systemic level. Now, a model that I just wanted to show very briefly before we close and move on to questions. And this isn't actually from systems thinking. This is adapted from CBT, cognitive behavioural theory or cognitive behavioural therapy. But the idea here is that actually what we see, the adversity, is often shaped by our beliefs. Like what we even see as a problem is shaped by our beliefs. And the consequences is shaped by our beliefs as well. For example, if you or I were to see a child that we perceived as being a bit chubby and overweight, well, in some countries we might think, well, that's a problem, and we might think about diabetes. But if food is scarce, it might be a positive thing, and actually a good thing and not a problem at all. So the beliefs and the context play a lot on what we see as a problem, and the same for our stakeholders. But the thing to do is to dispute the beliefs, our own beliefs, our stakeholders' beliefs, surface those perspectives, help co-create a more holistic view of the problem situation, one that everyone can buy into. Then we can execute, energize action, and execute an intervention, a hypothesis of value to test and learn. In doing this, we avoid that expensive oscillation, we avoid those bin parking moments, and we can start to build or become an organization that learns. We can sense and respond to feedback in the same way as the shower example I gave earlier, with that intervention and experimentation. Challenging perspectives is really important, as is celebrating intersections. Now, by that I mean the natural overlaps between different disciplines. BA and UX, BA and systems thinking, BA and whatever. There's so much learning at those fringes. And I think as BAs, there's a lot we can learn from the fringes of our profession as well as from the centre. So in summary, situations are often messy. That tool, or that categorization of difficulty versus mess, really useful. If it's a mess, we should choose the right tool. We might use systems thinking tools as well as our more traditional BA tools. Neither is better or worse. Some are just perhaps more appropriate for certain contexts. We naturally think holistically, so there's that natural intersection with systems thinking, and remember those boundaries and perspectives are really important. In closing, before we move to questions, one final ponder point. I opened with an example of a system, a situation that oscillated, that created this workaround, this bin parking moment. My question to all of us is, how many bin parking workarounds have been delivered in your organisation, my organisation, all of our organisations? And how can we, as an enthusiastic, empowered community, global community of business analysts and change practitioners, how can we help avoid those situations so that we co-create really valuable outcomes for our organizations, but even more importantly, for the communities in which we serve. And with that, I will say thank you, and I will turn back over to questions.
Perfect. Thanks, Adrian. Just a couple of comments. One from Amy Roberts. She wants to do a shout out. She's calling in from Rochester, Minnesota, and she loved the picture.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, it was Hoover Elementary School, but you probably recognize it. So great to know that there are some Rochester folk on the line.
And then David Smith just wanted to say, great presentation, Adrian.
Oh, thank you, David. That's pleased you enjoyed it.
So we only have about 5 minutes and several questions, so we'll start with the first one. How do you suggest a consultant in an enterprise environment convince stakeholders that their problems are much more than linear and worth tackling as such?
Okay, that is a great question. And the challenge with, so being a consultant has some significant advantages because you have no vested interest. But also, it means that potentially your position is more tenuous than someone who's employed. And I think, frankly, whether we're internal or external, sometimes, like, it would be great if we could just go in and say, look, we need to look beyond the immediate cause effect. But sometimes you're parachuted in, and you get the JDI, just do it. And you know what? Sometimes we need to follow that to an extent. But you can do the other stuff by stealth, and what I mean by that is it might be, well, yeah, we're doing 2 tracks. We're doing the just do it, but we're also validating that we're doing the right thing by creating a multiple cause diagram. Now, probably when we create a multiple cause diagram, the stakeholders start to see for themselves it's more messy than they thought. Then they will probably want to put the brakes on, but we've done it in a really tactful way that is politically sensitive, but also helps to expose the real issues. If the person asking that question wants to know more, contact me offline, because that's quite a big area that I'd love to chat some more about.
Perfect. And going a little bit further, is multi-cause diagramming useful for more than just current state analysis?
That's an interesting question. I've only really used the yes is the answer, but it's not. I've never really considered it like an as is and a to be. But what it's very useful for is, here's our mental model of the current situation, and what I found it particularly useful is then drawing a rope around the scope and saying, here's the bit of the problem we're going to bite off. But then what you can do is say, we're going to bite that problem off by, I don't know, by doing a process change here and an IT system change here, or a data change there. So it tends to become almost a thought device, a mental map that then leads to other analysis artifacts. I'm sure there are other ways it could be used, and if anyone's using it in another way, by the way, I would love to hear, because it's a really versatile technique.
Okay. Question regarding Agile. So is the Agile approach better for systems thinking? And if not, what other approach would be good for following with systems thinking?
Yeah, that's a big, tricky question. I mean, it's a really good question as well. I think that, I mean, a typical BA answer, but it depends, and it sort of depends on what we mean by Agile, because there are some people that really just are referring to a delivery methodology, and some people are talking about a software delivery methodology with Agile, others are talking about a project management approach or a framework. I think I would take a step back and say, actually, systems thinking really helps organizational agility. And if you think about interventions, well, actually, if you need to test and learn, there will be interventions that lead themselves really well to an adaptive, what BA might call an adaptive approach. So agile or iterative or incremental or something. There might be others that by their nature have to be a more linear approach, but it's sort of almost like systems thinking is at the if we diagnose with systems thinking, then you could potentially deliver an intervention with Agile if you chose to do so.
Okay, and unfortunately that's time for our webinar. There are other questions, and if you're open to it, Adrian, I can perhaps send them to you and we can get the other questions answered at some point.
Yeah, I would really encourage that, and just quickly, if people want to tweet me or email me, I would love to connect. And just finally, if you like what I've had to say, I'm known as a prolific blogger. I'm never really sure if that's a compliment, but there are about 260 articles on my blog, so go take a look as well. I'd really appreciate it, and hit the subscribe if you like it.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Adrian, for being with us today. We truly appreciate it, and thank you to all of you who were able to join us today. The presentation, along with the recording of the webinar, will be posted on the IIBA website under Webinar Archives within 5 business days of this live presentation if you want to revisit and dive a little bit deeper. And with that, I will say goodbye and have a lovely rest of your morning, afternoon, or evening.